in the heart of 9th century Europe, a world still recovering from the fall of the Roman Empire. Power was not just a matter of kings and armies. It was in the delicate balance of alliances, the strategic marriages, and the ever-present game of politics. In a time when the world was divided by borders, ideologies, and bloodlines, one woman's fate was bound to intertwine with the most powerful rulers of her age. Her name was Engelberga. The year was 860, and the Carolingian Empire, once an empire of glory, was now a fragmented shadow of its former self. Yet, within this chaos, the threads of power were still strong enough to shape the future of an entire continent. Engelberga was born into a time of uncertainty, the daughter of a noble family whose fortunes were intertwined with the fate of the great empire. Her lineage, though not one of royal blood, was enough to catch the eye of those who held dominion over the fractured kingdoms of Europe. Her life, a tapestry of intrigue, love, betrayal, and power, would soon be woven into the fabric of history. Yet, as with all stories, hers began not with grandeur, but with the quiet anticipation of a young woman coming of age in a world that could be both cruel and kind. Depending on one's station in life, at the tender age of 16, Engelberga found herself at the crossroads of duty and desire. The echoes of the Carolingian dynasty still reverberated through the halls of power, and she, like many women of her time, would be called upon to play a role she never chose, a role that would determine the course of her life and that of the kingdoms around her. The path before her was one of survival, of navigating the treacherous waters of courtly politics, of aligning herself with kings and emperors whose fates were just as uncertain as her own. Her marriage to Louis II, the King of Italy, would be the first step in a journey that would see her rise to prominence in a world dominated by men. It would also become the battleground where personal ambition, loyalty, and the weight of history collided. Engelberga's story, though not one of world-changing events, would shape the very world she lived in. As the years passed, Engelberga would come to learn that the power of a woman in the medieval world lay not in the sword, but in the quiet strength of alliances, in the whispered secrets of the court, and in the deep reservoirs of resilience that allowed her to withstand the trials of a life governed by the whims of kings and emperors. But for now, at the dawn of her adulthood, she stood on the edge of a future she could not yet see, her destiny tied to a man whose name would become synonymous with both strength and tragedy. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the snow-capped Alps, casting a golden hue over the sprawling plains of northern Italy. The year was 860, and the political landscape of Europe was as volatile as the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It was a time when dynasties rose and fell with the sway of a ruler's ambition, and every union, even a royal marriage, was a political tool in the great game of power. Engelberga stood at the window of her family's modest castle in the foothills, staring out across the land that would soon be claimed by another. At 16, she was already a woman shaped by the strict traditions of her time, her beauty, grace, and intelligence well known to the noble families of Italy. Yet, in the eyes of her father, Count Adalbert, it was not these qualities that mattered most. It was her ability to cement alliances through marriage that would define her legacy. In the halls of the castle, there was a hushed excitement. Rumors had circulated for months about a possible suitor, a man whose name carried the weight of imperial authority. Louis II, the King of Italy and the son of Emperor Lothar I, had requested her hand in marriage. For Engelberga, the news came with mixed emotions. She had been raised to understand the necessity of such unions. Marriages were not about love but power, not about the heart but the crown. Yet, as the daughter of a nobleman who was far from royal, this marriage could elevate her family to heights they had never dreamed of. It was not long before she stood before the assembly of noblemen and her father, her heart racing, hands trembling as the negotiations unfolded. The terms were clear. Engelberga would marry Louis II, not out of affection, but to seal an alliance between her family and the powerful Carolingian line. It was a union that would secure her place in history, but one that would demand her loyalty above all else. When Louis arrived, it was with the grandeur befitting his status. A tall man with dark, sharp features and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He was both imposing and regal. There was little warmth in his gaze when he first laid eyes on Engelberga, but his assessment was swift and efficient, as it always was when it came to matters of state. Engelberga, despite the anticipation swirling in her chest, stood composed. She knew her role. She had been prepared for this moment her whole life. There was no room for hesitation, and yet, as she gazed upon Louis, she couldn't help but wonder what her life would be like as his wife. Would it be one of grandeur and power, as the courtiers whispered, or would she be nothing more than another pawn in the Game of Thrones? Their marriage was swiftly arranged, and within weeks, Engelberga left the comfort of her home behind, riding out of the valley where she had spent her childhood and into a new world. The city of Pavia, where Louis ruled, was a sprawling metropolis of marble and stone, the center of Italian politics, the streets teeming with soldiers, merchants, and priests. It was a city of opulence and grandeur, but beneath the surface, it was a city of treachery and intrigue. Louis II had inherited the throne of Italy after the death of his father, Lothar I. But his reign was far from secure. The Carolingian Empire, once a mighty force under Charlemagne, was fracturing, its territories bickering over succession and loyalty. Italy, with its wealth and strategic importance, was a prize that many sought to control. Louis's reign was plagued by external threats and internal unrest, and the marriage to Engelberga was, in part, his attempt to solidify his power in the face of these challenges. As Engelberga arrived at the royal court, she was immediately struck by the contrast between the luxurious palace and the tension that seemed to hang in the air. The nobles here were not her father's peers. These were men and women who had lived their entire lives in the political maelstrom of royal courts, where alliances were forged as quickly as they were broken. Her marriage to Louis II was an important piece in this game of political chess. But Engelberga was no mere pawn. Her sharp mind, trained in the arts of diplomacy and statecraft by her father, quickly became apparent. She knew that her position as queen was precarious, and that survival in this world depended not just on the power of her husband, but on her own ability to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. Louis, despite his position as king, was not the most powerful figure at court. His authority was often contested by his vassals, and his relationship with the papacy was strained. Engelberga quickly understood that her new life would require more than just submission to her husband. It would demand cunning, resilience, and the ability to read the ever-shifting alliances of the court. The first few months in Pavia were filled with ceremonies, banquets, and the constant stream of visitors that came to pay homage to the newlywed queen. Engelberga, ever the diplomat, played her part with grace, but beneath her composed exterior, she was learning the ropes of court life, the delicate balance between pleasing her husband and securing her own influence. One evening, as they sat together in their chambers, Louis, his brow furrowed in thought, turned to her. "Engelberga," he said, his voice low and heavy with the weight of leadership. "You know as well as I do that our marriage is not simply a union of two hearts. It is a political necessity. We must secure our hold on Italy. Our enemies are many, and our friends few." Engelberga nodded. She had always known that, but she also knew that to survive in this world, to truly hold power, one needed more than just political alliances. One needed to understand the people, the desires, and the weaknesses of those around them. In the months that followed, Engelberga would learn this lesson well, through both triumphs and tragedies. The kingdom of Italy, like her marriage, would prove to be far more complex than she had ever imagined. The journey from the quiet hills of Engelberga's home to the bustling heart of the Carolingian realm was long and treacherous. Engelberga had been raised in the countryside, surrounded by the familiar faces of her family and the occasional noble guest. But nothing could prepare her for the overwhelming spectacle that awaited her in the royal court. Louis II's realm, with its rich history and power, lay at the center of a fractured empire, Italy, still reeling from the collapse of Charlemagne's once mighty domain. The city of Pavia, where Louis held court, was a place of grandeur and decay, where ancient marble halls stood beside the newly built fortresses of the Carolingian dynasty. It was a place where loyalty was bought with gold, and betrayal was an ever-present threat. Engelberga arrived in Pavia amidst the clash of swords and the hum of political maneuvering. The royal palace, with its high ceilings and tapestries depicting the great conquests of the Carolingians, was filled with the scent of lavish feasts and the whisper of secrets. It was a far cry from the modest life she had known, but as she stepped into the grand chamber, she felt the weight of her destiny settle upon her shoulders. Louis II himself, a tall man in his early 30s, stood before her with the cold, calculating gaze of a ruler who knew the cost of ambition. His dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made Engelberga's heart beat faster, not with attraction, but with the recognition of a man who understood the value of alliances and knew how to wield power. Her first encounter with Louis was formal, steeped in the ritualistic customs of a royal marriage. They spoke little, their words measured and careful, for there was little to say that had not already been agreed upon by their families. Yet as Engelberga looked at him, she saw not the lover she had been told she would find, but a man who was not unlike her father, driven, ruthless, and deeply concerned with his position. This was not a union forged in love, but in strategy. Over the following weeks, Engelberga became accustomed to the dizzying world of the royal court. She learned the subtle art of navigating courtly politics, how to smile at the right moment, how to bow at the appropriate times, how to speak only when spoken to. Louis, preoccupied with the affairs of state, rarely had time to engage with her beyond the obligatory discussions of their marriage and the politics that surrounded it. But in those rare moments when their eyes met across the room, Engelberga began to understand the weight of the life she had chosen. She was no longer just the daughter of a count, no longer a simple noblewoman. She was the Empress of Italy, the wife of Louis II. As the months passed, Engelberga's role in the court grew more defined. She attended royal ceremonies, played her part in the grand feasts, and presented herself as the epitome of Carolingian grace and poise. Yet, beneath the surface of this new life, Engelberga felt a growing tension. Her marriage to Louis was not just a means to consolidate power. It was a delicate balance of personal and political survival. The court, with its hidden alliances and whispered rumors, was as treacherous as it was beautiful. And as Engelberga moved deeper into this world, she began to realize that her true strength would come not from being a queen consort, but from being a silent observer of power, the kind of power that could protect or destroy, depending on who controlled it. One evening, as the sun set over the palatial grounds, Engelberga found herself alone in a quiet corridor of the palace. She paused, gazing out at the sprawling gardens below. It was in this moment of solitude that she felt the weight of her position most acutely. She was no longer a daughter, no longer a simple noblewoman, but a pawn in a far greater game. But as the cool breeze swept through the open window, Engelberga realized that she had one thing that no one could take away, her mind. And it was with this mind that she would play the game of power. As much a player as any man in the court. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Louis II's reign over Italy was increasingly threatened by external forces. The kingdom was rife with rebellion, and the specter of war loomed on the horizon. Yet, through all of this, Engelberga remained steadfast. As her marriage to Louis settled into its political rhythm, she found herself not simply a wife, but a partner in the kingdom's survival. She knew that, in this volatile world, her strength would not lie in her beauty, her charm, or her ability to placate the court's nobles. It would lie in her ability to understand the shifting currents of power and to steer them, ever so carefully, in the direction she chose. Little did she know that the greatest test of her strength was yet to come. Engelberga's days at the royal court began to stretch out like a series of endless, polished corridors. The halls of Pavia, which had once seemed so magnificent, now felt cold and unwelcoming. It was not the grandeur that unsettled her, but the ever-present sense of calculation that hung in the air like a thick fog. Every gesture, every word spoken, was laced with politics. Louis, despite the formalities of their marriage, remained distant both physically and emotionally. He was not a man given to displays of affection. In the court of Pavia, affection was a luxury reserved for those who had time to waste. For Louis II, time was precious, and every moment spent in idle conversation was a moment stolen from the machinations of power. Engelberga soon realized that her role here was not that of a loving wife, but that of a silent partner in a much larger game. The court was a cauldron of rivalry, deceit, and ambition, where men and women vied for favor, and alliances were forged not with blood, but with strategic marriages, wealth, and promises of power. Engelberga had been raised to understand the importance of such alliances, but it was one thing to learn about politics and quite another to live within it, to feel its weight on her chest every day. Her marriage to Louis II, though politically advantageous for both families, had not brought the peace she had imagined. Instead, it had thrust her into a world of uncertainty. Her husband, though crowned as king, was far from the all-powerful ruler she had expected. His authority was constantly challenged by the noble factions who sought to control the kingdom from behind the scenes. And Louis himself was not the stalwart leader that history might one day paint him to be. He was a man of contradictions, brilliant in his strategizing, but weak in his ability to inspire true loyalty. As winter descended upon Italy, Engelberga found herself growing more isolated in her royal duties. She was no longer a young girl from a distant castle. She was the Queen of Italy, the wife of Louis II, and the mother of his heirs. Yet, her presence in the court seemed to matter less with each passing day. She was often relegated to the background while her husband met with bishops, noblemen, and generals. The weight of her crown felt heavy on her head, not from the gold, but from the expectations placed upon her shoulders. But Engelberga had a resilience that many overlooked. Beneath the surface of the quiet, dutiful wife was a mind sharp and calculating. She watched as Louis engaged in endless negotiations with his vassals, with the men who constantly sought to undermine him. She saw the fissures in his alliances, the subtle ways in which his power was slipping through his fingers. And slowly, Engelberga began to understand that survival in this world would require more than just the beauty and grace she had been taught to cultivate. It would require cunning, the ability to read the shifting tides of power, and, most importantly, the ability to play the game. One cold evening, as Engelberga sat in the dimly lit royal chamber, her fingers tracing the edge of a tapestry depicting the Battle of Fontenoy, her thoughts turned to the future. It was clear that Louis would not be able to hold onto his kingdom without strengthening his position. The nobles in the north were restless, and the mighty kingdom of East Francia was looking for any opportunity to assert its dominance over the fragmented Italian territories. In that moment, Engelberga made a decision. She would no longer remain a passive figure in her own life. If her husband was to falter, she would have to be the one to hold their legacy together. As she gazed into the fire, the reflection of the flames danced across her face, and a quiet resolve settled within her. The next few weeks were a blur of courtly events and whispered conversations. Engelberga began to make her presence felt, not through overt displays of power, but through the subtle art of influence. She forged alliances with powerful women in the court, wives of dukes, queens, and influential noblewomen who had long been overlooked by the men who ruled the kingdom. Their conversations, at first about trivial matters of fashion and court etiquette, slowly turned to politics. Engelberga's sharp intellect and quiet determination earned her the respect of these women. who were themselves pawns in the royal game but wielded considerable power in their own right. Her influence began to grow, but so did the tensions around her. Louis was becoming increasingly agitated by the growing power of the noble factions, and whispers of discontent spread like wildfire through the court. The once proud Carolingian dynasty was teetering on the brink of collapse, and with every passing day, Engelberga could feel the ground beneath her feet shifting. The year was 863, and the shadows of rebellion were beginning to take shape. The winter of 861 was one of the harshest Pavia had seen in years. The biting cold seeped into the stone walls of the royal palace, and the winds howled like restless spirits through the narrow streets of the city. But it was not the chill of the season that most troubled Engelberga. It was the growing sense of danger that seemed to settle like a shadow over the royal court, a shadow that was cast not by the weather, but by those who had once pledged loyalty to Louis II. Though the court appeared outwardly serene, Engelberga quickly realized that beneath the surface, discontent festered. The Italian nobility, a fragmented and often unruly force, had never been truly loyal to Louis. His rule was contested from all sides, from the nobles in the north who resented his increasing authority, to the powerful clerics who believed that their influence had been sidelined in favor of secular control. These factions, each with their own ambitions, were like coiled snakes, ready to strike when the moment was right. Louis himself seemed increasingly withdrawn, spending more time in the seclusion of his chambers, consumed by the weight of his responsibilities. Engelberga, though still a young woman, could not help but feel the growing tension in the air. The marriage that had once seemed like an opportunity to strengthen her family's position was now a gilded cage. She was not merely a passive bystander in the drama unfolding around her. She was the wife of a king, and the eyes of the court were constantly upon her, waiting for any sign of weakness, any indication that the throne could be seized. It was during this time that Engelberga began to notice the subtle changes in her husband's behavior. Where once there had been a cold but professional distance between them, now there was an unmistakable tension. Louis had become more secretive, even to her, his once close confidant. He would often leave the palace under the cover of darkness, returning hours later with an air of guarded secrecy. Whispers began to spread throughout the court. Was he conspiring with his enemies? Was he losing control? One evening, as Engelberga prepared for yet another banquet, this one in honor of an alliance with a northern duke, she was approached by a trusted maidservant. The girl's face was pale, her hands trembling as she whispered something into Engelberga's ear. There were murmurs of a growing conspiracy against Louis, a plot that had been brewing in the shadows for months. Powerful faction, led by Duke Berenger of Friuli, was rumored to be gathering forces to seize the throne from Louis. Engelberga's heart sank. She had known the court was a dangerous place, but the reality of betrayal from within her own walls felt like a cold slap to her face. The news hit her hard, but she knew there was no time to falter. She was the queen, and her survival now depended on her ability to navigate these treacherous waters. Engelberga found herself at a crossroads. Should she remain loyal to her husband, the king who had promised her so little, or should she begin to think of her own future? That night, after the banquet, she stood by her chamber window, looking out over the flickering lights of the city below. The palace was quiet, the distant sounds of the feast still echoing in her mind. Her mind raced as she thought about the conspiracy, her marriage, and the fate of the kingdom. She could not ignore the growing unrest within her. It was clear that Louis's reign, and perhaps their marriage, was teetering on the edge of collapse. As the days passed, Engelberga found herself walking a tightrope. Her husband remained distant, consumed by his secretive dealings, while she was left to observe, to listen, and to wait. The once sterile walls of Pavia now seemed alive with danger. Every meeting, every glance between the courtiers, carried the weight of unspoken words. It was in this world of deception and power plays that Engelberga would come to realize the true cost of the crown. and the price she might have to pay to keep it. But the shadows of betrayal were closing in, and she could no longer stay in the shadows herself. The court was a battleground, and she would have to decide, would she play the game of power, or would she let herself be consumed by it? As the first hints of spring crept across the land, Engelberga knew that she had to act before the storm broke, and everything she had known was swept away. The tension in the court of Pavia grew unbearable with each passing month. Engelberga could feel it in the coldness of Louis's gaze, in the whispered conversations of the courtiers who no longer spoke openly in her presence. For all the strategic marriages, the alliances forged through blood and gold, there was one thing that no one, not even a queen, could escape: the ceaseless tide of power and the relentless ambition of those who sought to claim it. By the spring of 862, it was clear that Louis's position was increasingly precarious. The factions within the kingdom, ever restless, had begun to take more open steps toward undermining his authority. A growing coalition of nobles had aligned themselves with a rival claimant to the throne, one who was backed by both local aristocrats and foreign forces. It was a delicate web of conspiracy, one that seemed to tighten with every passing day. Engelberga, once a quiet observer of these intrigues, now found herself swept up in them. As the queen, her role had initially been confined to that of a ceremonial figure, standing beside her husband during feasts and royal events, smiling at the right moments, and speaking only when spoken to. But as the political climate in Pavia grew more volatile, she realized that her position as queen could either be her greatest strength or her greatest weakness. Her alliance with Louis was no longer just a personal bond, it was a lifeline, and she had to decide whether to trust it or cut herself loose. The secret meetings between Louis and his trusted advisors, once a mere whisper in the halls of the palace, were becoming bolder. Engelberga had always been sharp, her keen intellect a tool she had honed from years of observing the maneuverings of her father's court. She began to overhear fragments of conversations about foreign mercenaries, about the loyalty of the bishops, and about the threat posed by the rival claimant, who was gaining support among the very people Louis had once considered his allies. But it wasn't just the politics of the kingdom that weighed heavily on Engelberga's mind. There was something more personal, something even darker, that had begun to take root. She had started to feel an unsettling distance between herself and Louis. The coldness that had once been a simple feature of their relationship had now deepened into something more troubling. He had become a man she barely recognized, a man who was no longer her husband in any real sense. She was still, in name, his queen, but their marriage had become a formality, a distant arrangement rather than a partnership. Late one night, as Engelberga paced the quiet halls of the palace, she was summoned to Louis's private chambers. The guards at the door, who had once greeted her with the respect due a queen, now gave her wary looks. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the air. She stepped inside, finding Louis seated at a large wooden table, maps and letters spread out before him. He looked up at her with the same distant expression, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, or something darker. "Engelberga," he said, his voice low and strained, "there are matters I can no longer shield you from. I fear for our kingdom and for us." He hesitated, then continued, his voice almost a whisper, "There are those who would see me fall, and they would use you as a means to that end." Engelberga felt a knot tighten in her chest. She had known this moment would come, had sensed it for weeks. Louis's power was slipping, and with it, their once sturdy marriage. She had never imagined that the court of Pavia, which had once seemed so grand and full of promise, would become a place of such treachery and uncertainty. "We must be cautious," Louis continued, his eyes scanning the room as though the walls themselves might betray him. "There are spies in the court, men I once trusted. The rival claimant, Berenger, has more influence than I anticipated. If we are to hold the throne, we must make a decision, and quickly. I need your loyalty, now more than ever." For a long moment, Engelberga remained silent, her mind racing. The weight of the decision before her was crushing. To remain loyal to Louis, to stand by her husband and protect the throne, meant risking her own life and the future of her family. But to betray him, would that be any less perilous? She had been raised to understand the importance of alliances, but the idea of betraying the man she had married, however cold and distant he might be, felt like an insurmountable betrayal of herself. "You ask much of me, Louis," she replied at last, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "But if you wish for my loyalty, you must first show me that it is not already too late for us, for our kingdom." Louis's gaze softened slightly, but his features remained hard. He rose from the table and walked toward her, a man once powerful, now desperate. "I will do what I must," he said, his voice low and strained. "But we cannot afford to wait any longer." And in that moment, Engelberga realized that the court of Pavia was no longer a place of royal dreams. It had become a battlefield, one where every decision could be fatal, and the tide of power, once so firmly in Louis's hands, was now slipping away, pulling both of them into the storm. By the summer of 863, the fragile peace that had held together the Carolingian realm had begun to unravel. Louis II, a king whose power had once seemed so unshakable, now found himself besieged from all sides. Engelberga watched with a mixture of fear and fascination as the court's intrigue reached a fever pitch. The rival claimant to the throne, Charles of Provence, had rallied support among the northern Italian nobles, promising them a return to the older ways of governance. He presented himself as a unifier, the rightful heir to the Carolingian crown, and, most dangerously, as the man who could restore stability to a fractured kingdom. As the weeks wore on, Engelberga realized that Louis was losing his grip on the kingdom. His health began to deteriorate, his once sharp eyes now clouded with exhaustion. As he retreated further into the isolation of his chambers, he was a king who had failed to inspire loyalty, a man whose reign had been marked by missteps and missed opportunities. But even as the storm of rebellion loomed, Engelberga remained steadfast. She knew that the fate of the kingdom and her own fate depended on the choices she would make in the coming days. In early autumn, the situation finally came to a head. One night, as the air grew colder and the streets of Pavia fell silent beneath a blanket of fog, Engelberga was summoned to a clandestine meeting in the royal chambers. Louis, pale and weakened, was there, flanked by his most trusted advisor, a man named Count Eberhard. Engelberga had never trusted Eberhard, a man whose loyalty seemed always in question. But tonight she could sense the desperation in his voice. "We cannot wait any longer," Louis said, his voice hoarse and trembling. "The rebellion is gathering strength. If we do not strike now, we will lose everything." Engelberga looked at her husband, the man she had once thought of as a ruler of great potential. Now, all she saw was a shadow of the king who had been promised to her in marriage. But despite the disillusionment that had settled in her heart, she still felt a flicker of duty toward him. She knew what was at stake, not just for Louis, but for herself, for their future, and for the kingdom that was slipping through their fingers. "You're not strong enough, Louis," Engelberga said softly, her words heavy with the weight of truth. "The court no longer supports you. The nobles are already in motion. We need to act quickly, or we risk losing everything." Louis's eyes flickered with a mixture of defiance and resignation. He had always been proud, and even now, in the face of certain defeat, he was unwilling to surrender his throne without a fight. Engelberga knew what needed to be done, but the path ahead was fraught with peril. "I cannot rule this kingdom alone anymore," Louis said, almost to himself. "And neither can you." The realization hit Engelberga like a thunderclap. She had spent so long living in the shadow of her husband's power, trying to fulfill her role as queen. But now she had to face the truth. If she wanted to save her family, her legacy, and her own life, she would have to take matters into her own hands. The men around her might wield swords and speak of armies, but Engelberga would wield something far more dangerous: influence, cunning, and the ability to shape events from the shadows. As the days turned into weeks, the rebellion gathered steam. Engelberga, now at the center of the storm, began to make her own moves. She reached out to those who still owed loyalty to the Carolingian crown, offering her own brand of negotiation marriage alliances, promises of power, and, in some cases, threats wrapped in honeyed words. But the true danger came from within. The court, once a place of loyalty, was now a den of vipers, each noble plotting his own ascent to power. One night, as the first snows of winter began to fall upon the city, Engelberga learned of a plot to kill Louis. His enemies, those within his closest circle, had turned on him. The knife was already being sharpened by the hands of those who had once sworn fealty. And so, with a heart hardened by the betrayals that surrounded her, Engelberga made the decision that would change everything. She would not wait for the storm to consume her. She would strike first. The winds of fate howled outside the walls of Pavia, as though nature itself was caught in the turmoil that had engulfed the kingdom. Engelberga stood beside her husband, her hands steady, though her heart raced with a mixture of dread and resolve. Louis II, the man she had married not out of love but out of duty, now seemed like a shadow of the king he once was. The weight of his crown had become unbearable, and she knew, perhaps more than he, that the storm was not just political, but personal. The hour of reckoning was at hand. The meeting that night was the beginning of the end. The decision was made to gather the royal army and strike at the rebel forces before they could march on Pavia. It was a desperate plan, a last attempt to hold on to power. Louis, broken by illness and disillusionment, was too weak to lead the troops himself, and it was left to Engelberga, once a mere pawn in the game of politics, to become an active player in a war that threatened to swallow them all. As dawn broke over the horizon, Engelberga stood at the gates of Pavia, looking out at the forces that had gathered in the royal camp. She was no soldier, but the events of the past years had forced her to learn how to navigate the brutal world of warfare and power. For the first time, she understood the true nature of leadership: the sacrifices, the lies, and the bloodshed. The battle that followed was swift and brutal. Engelberga rode beside the royal army, her eyes hard and her heart cold. The rebels, though numerous, were disorganized, their ranks shattered by the suddenness of the royal assault. For a moment, it seemed as though Louis's reign would be saved, that the rebellion could be crushed beneath the weight of his army. But victory came at a high cost. Louis, weakened by months of illness, succumbed to the wounds he had sustained during the skirmish. His death was not immediate, but inevitable. The king who had once been so full of ambition and dreams now lay broken on the battlefield, his body a mere shadow of the man who had ruled Italy for so many years. Engelberga, standing over him in the final moments, felt no triumph. She did not rejoice in his passing, nor did she mourn. She felt only the weight of the crown shifting onto her own shoulders. With Louis's death, Engelberga became the de facto ruler of the kingdom. The news of her husband's death sent shockwaves through Pavia, and soon, the nobles of the court began to question the future of the Carolingian line. Would Engelberga, a woman, be able to hold onto the throne? Would she be able to maintain control of the fractious Italian kingdom that had caused so much bloodshed? In the days that followed, Engelberga made a choice that would change the course of her life and the history of the Carolingian dynasty. She did not seize the crown for herself, but instead, she recognized the necessity of a successor. She sent emissaries to the emperor in the north, calling for a new ruler, someone who could unite the kingdom and bring stability. But it was too late. The factions within the kingdom had already begun to fracture further. And Engelberga, realizing that her role had always been that of a mediator, withdrew from the politics of the throne. She had played her part, Her marriage had served its purpose, and her strength had been proven in the face of adversity. Now, she chose peace, choosing to retreat from the world of kings and warriors. She spent the remainder of her days in the quiet solitude of a convent, far from the intrigues of the royal court. History would remember her not as the queen who ruled a kingdom, but as the woman who stood in the balance between destruction and salvation, the last of the Carolingians to truly understand the cost of power. Engelberga left behind a legacy not of conquest, but of sacrifice, and in her quiet withdrawal, she left the world to reckon with the price of ambition and the fleeting nature of crowns. The kingdoms of Europe would continue to rise and fall, as they always had, but Engelberga, having lived through the turbulent tides of history, understood one unshakable truth. In the end, it was not power that defined a ruler, but the choices made in the face of its inevitable loss. And so, the story of Engelberga, Queen of Italy, came to its close, not with a crown upon her head, but with the peaceful acceptance of a life lived fully in the service of others.